Good morning. Welcome to Centenary's annual presidential convocation as we start a new year. To begin this ceremony, I would like to introduce Reverend Lindy Broderick, chaplain of Centenary College, to bring an invocation.
Will you please join me in an attitude of prayer? God of many names, Jehovah, Yahweh, Allah, Spirit of life, God our Father, God our Mother, fill us with hope and optimism as we return to school during these unusual times in the midst of a global pandemic. Surround us and protect us as we take responsibility and the necessary steps to keep each other safe from this unseen virus. Instill in us a sense of resolve and determination so that we will not let fear set us back or keep us from achieving our goals and reaching for our dreams. When we become frustrated and lose our patience because of the restrictions and changes, soothe us and give us rest. Remind us that this too shall pass. Remind us to breathe and seek solace in you, O God of many names. We return to this semester with gratitude and joy for this institution and for the gift of learning. Open our hearts and our minds as we forge ahead into this semester with courage, determination, and grit. Foster in us compassion and kindness in the days and months ahead. Amen. And now I invite Dr. Karen Soule, Provost and Dean of the College, to the podium.
Good morning, Centenary students, faculty, and staff. I don't know where I'm looking. Thank you for tuning in to President's Convocation. It feels very strange to stand up here in my regalia and look out into an almost empty chapel, but it is an adjustment that I'm willing to make to continue with this important tradition. And honestly, over the past few months, I have learned that shifting my perspective, searching for unique solutions, and communicating in new ways has led to some exciting discoveries and positive outcomes. Importantly, I have learned that the Centenary community is resilient and resourceful, and that we value our connection to each other. So whether you are watching this from your residence hall, from a classroom, from an office, from your home, or from my new favorite place on campus, Tent M, I welcome you, and I'm truly glad you are here. As members of the Centenary community, we hold ourselves and each other to the highest standards of academic and civic integrity through the Honor Code. Class of 2024, you added your names to the Honor Code book during orientation. In doing so, along with your classmates and generations of Centenary students before you, you pledged to uphold a culture of honesty. It is my hope that this pledge will extend beyond the classroom and well beyond your years as a Centenary student. It is now my great privilege to invite Chief Justice of the Honor Court, Aaron Tisdale, forward for the presentation of the Honor Code book. Thank you. And now I welcome President Holoman back to the podium for his remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Soul, and thank you to Aaron and all the members of the Honor Court and to all the students who abide so faithfully by that important pledge. Before I start my formal remarks, a couple of pieces of housekeeping, if you will. One of the things that happens at this ceremony is that we distribute to our first-year students their class of 2024 challenge coin, of which I have one here. Challenge coins, if you're not familiar, are a fairly recent tradition coming out of the military. They have roots back into ancient times, but the idea is that if you're a member of a unit of some sort and you have your challenge coin, signifies that, and you can go onto Wikipedia, your favorite internet reference, and learn about different fun traditions of what happens if you don't have your challenge coin with you. But it's a way of identifying with your class, and Dr. Soul and I will be making arrangements in the next few days to distribute these to our first-year students, so keep an eye out for that, and put your challenge coin someplace where you can lay your hands on it every so often. I also like to note, as usual, there are passport points associated with this event, and Reverend Broderick will have that information, and it will be up at the end of this ceremony as we listen to the wonderful Centenary choir on recording sing the alma mater. So stay tuned for that, as they say. So once again, welcome to the President's Convocation. In this unusual year, we're trying hard to retain as much as we can of our rituals. Rituals are important, and this is one of our more important ones. Usually at this talk, I start with some reminders of why we have convocations. Convocations are an important part of higher education going back to the 1500s, and they celebrate all manner of things: openings of new buildings, retirements of senior professors, but most often to do what we do today, which is to welcome you to a new year and to welcome you into our community of scholars. Centenary actually has probably a larger number than many schools of convocations. Partly that's because our small size makes it somewhat easier to assemble everyone, but more significantly, I think it represents our commitment to community and to coming together, the very meaning of the word convocation. I also usually note that convocation, the ceremony, is the formal end, if you will, of the orientation period. And I hope that you have been made to feel welcomed and not too overwhelmed, even with new requirements and practices that have already been alluded to today. And from there, over the past 4 years, this is my fifth President's Convocation, we've gone on to talk about journeying and storytelling and vocation and other reflections on your time together with us that you're just beginning. Ways of thinking about how you knit your educational experience together into a meaningful whole. But today I want to look back just a little bit to this idea of orientation. Orientation. The student life staff and the faculty have done an amazing job recrafting and rethinking orientation, adapting to our new realities and our new challenges, continuing to make sure that orientation provides what it always has, which is the information that you need, making sure some of the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed as we get ready to start a new year. But I think it's worth taking a few minutes to step back and think more broadly about orientation, and I had fun doing some of that research to prepare this talk. I found out that orientation is actually a pretty recent word in the English language. Orient goes back to Chaucer, actually, in the 1300s, where he used it to mean, it comes from a Latin word, orientus, I think, oriens, meaning the place where the sun rises, so the east. And that was the meaning then, was a general reference to the east, and particularly the sky in the east. And then a little bit later, it becomes a verb, to orient, and especially an interesting verb that some of you will experience, maybe perhaps already have, as you tour the great cathedrals of Europe. They're aligned in east-west direction, and to orient took on this idea. And then about 150 years ago, we see the first emergence of a new noun, orientation, to bring things into alignment, to arrange, to be prepared. And from there, you go in all sorts of different directions, and there's a great debate around orientate. We look down on that usage in the United States, although it's more acceptable in Great Britain. And then we get to orienteering, which I think is a fascinating idea. Orienteering as a sport or a skill, I think you can even get a Boy Scout merit badge in orienteering. This sport, if you will, where you're plopped down in a strange location and expected to find your way out. And that seems like a useful metaphor to push on a little bit today as you start your journey. Orienteering. What's interesting, at least at first cut, about this is that where you start is not that important. Again, you're sort of set down someplace that you don't know where it is. Where you've come from doesn't really matter. And that's certainly true of our Centenary student body. You've come from a lot of places, both literally and figuratively. And that's good because, of course, as we'll talk about over and over again, we learn from those who are different from us. Think about all the books and movies that you have experienced where very different people come together, they overcome their differences, and they learn from each other. It's a classic trope of the movies. If you're old like me, and you might remember The Breakfast Club, a classic movie of that tradition where you have the jock and the oddball and so forth, and they come together. Maybe more recently, maybe The Avengers fits that, if that's more up your alley. And that's kind of a cool one to choose, because then you can decide which superhero you are. A couple of years ago, we talked about telling your story, and are you the hero of your own story? So if you all are the Avengers, you can decide which superhero. Don't be the guy with the bow and arrow, though. Nobody cares about him. So coming together as different people, we learn things. Where we came from, it's an important part of who we are, but it's not in our journey together. We move beyond that. Much more important than your starting point is knowing where you're going. And we could take that in a number of different directions, but I want to just emphasize briefly one aspect of that, which is the need to have both short-term goals and long-term goals. I was flipping around the television channels this weekend and watched the golf tournament and the PGA Championship, and there are several of the holes where the golfers can't see the green, they can't see the flagstick that they're aiming at, so they have to choose another landmark to aim at. Sailors, if they're on long journeys, I guess it's probably true for people on solid ground too, choose waypoints to hit as they go to their long journey. Because if all you have is a very distant goal and you're steering toward it, but if you're just a little bit off at every step, if that mistake or that diversion keeps compounding, you end up at the end of your journey far away from where you started. It's important to know where you're headed, but it's also important to have check-in goals, if you will, how you get there. But I don't want to set aside the possibility of being open to the possibility of new destinations. Perhaps you think you have a very clear goal of where you'll end up at the end of these 4 years. Perhaps you have a clear goal of your career. But one of the great joys of these 4 years, or however long you're with us at Centenary, is the opportunity to revisit those goals, both the short term and the long term. There's so many examples in the world of discoveries that were made when people were looking for something else and find something that is more valuable or more rewarding. Have your goals, but also be prepared to experience and learn from your surroundings as you move through those goals. Okay, so we've got our journey. We know where we're going. We've we got our team to go with us, perhaps, that we're learning from. What tools do you have to take with you on this journey? This is perhaps the central thing that we do at Centenary as part of a liberal arts education. We sometimes even use that metaphor of filling up your toolbox. You're going to face a lot of challenges over the course of your work life, and if all you have is one tool, that may not be applicable in all situations, especially if that tool is limited in time and space and applicability. I sometimes use my own example of when I was in college learning if to use the computer, you had to learn to computer program. And so I learned PL1, Programming Language 1. It's so old that was actually the name of it, Programming Language 1. That particular skill is not terribly useful. That tool has had to be put away. But other tools that you'll be given, the habits of mind, thinking clearly, speaking well, critical thinking, all those things we talk about, communicating, those are the tools we'll be filling you up with. If you're orienteering, you have your map and your compass. What else are you going to need? What do you have that you don't need? I heard a sermon on Sunday from Reverend Matt Rawle, this minister over at at Asbury United Methodist Church in Bossier, and he was drawing from another book called Canoeing the Mountains, and used the example of Lewis and Clark, and I just thought this was a fascinating metaphor, and I've had a lot of fun thinking about it since I heard about it. Lewis and Clark, as you probably know, were tasked by Thomas Jefferson to explore the Louisiana Purchase, this huge swath of North America that we had just purchased from the French, and really didn't know what was going to be out there. Thomas Jefferson was very smart, and yet he still thought that there was some chance that in the great plains that white people had never seen, they may encounter woolly mammoths and other prehistoric beasts. But what they really intended to find, of course, as you know from your grade school education maybe, was to find the so-called Northwest Passage. They were going to find an easy way to cross the continent and end up at the Pacific Ocean. And they assumed that they were going to be able to do this by boat. They were going to take their canoes and they were going to canoe up the Missouri River. And then perhaps they might have a little bit of a short portage to get over to the other side of the Continental Divide, and then they could sail without incident down to the Pacific. At some point, they get to the headwaters of the Missouri, and there's no other river for them to go to. They're confronted. They've traveled into the unknown, into an area that they really didn't know what they were headed for. And they get there, and instead of a river that they can set their canoes in, these canoes that they've portaged over shallow places and on and on and on, and now they're faced not by a river but by the wall of the Rocky Mountains. Those canoes aren't useful anymore. What are the tools that you're hanging on to that maybe aren't useful anymore? This is a question you're going to have to ask yourself routinely over the course of your work life and your work of being lifelong learners. It's worth thinking about a little bit. Why do we holding on to things is such a human idiosyncrasy? There's a wonderful book by a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Daniel Kahneman, called, I think it's called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, words to that effect. And he's not the first person to identify this, but maybe most clearly, the so-called sunk cost fallacy, that as humans, we're very prone to adding additional weight to things that have gone past that we can't really change anymore. I think maybe the clearest example that we're all familiar with is binge watching a television show. And you get in and you've watched 4 or 5 hours and you realize you're really not enjoying this. You're just not getting it. It's not doing it for you. But you got to keep watching, right? I got to watch the rest of it because I've already spent 5 hours watching the first part. It doesn't really make sense, right? You're not enjoying it. You're not going to get those 4 or 5 hours back. You could be doing something more fun with the next whatever number of hours. That's a sunk cost, but you keep doing it because you've already invested so much into it. Now, of course, you need to be mindful of where your investments are and so forth, but we hold on to things that don't do us any good, that can't be changed. It's just part of who we are as human beings. But as with many things that Kahneman identifies, if we're aware of them, we can at least know that we're making that decision, that potential error. We hold on to things. We hold on to things because they resonate with our underlying beliefs. And this is really sort of the last main point that I want to make. I know you've been thinking about during orientation, what do you believe? Beliefs are so important. Got to be careful talking about beliefs, though, because in just sort of everyday discourse, we use beliefs to mean a variety of different things, and to believe something can mean very different things, and we need to be careful about what we mean in any particular moment of use of that word. To believe something sometimes means something tentative. Well, I believe I'll be able to do that. I believe I'll be able to meet you masked for a visit, but something may come up. I believe that X, Y, or Z might happen, but I'm just not sure. It has this tentative nature to it. But then at the other end of the spectrum, of course, we talk about our deeply held beliefs. And some of you produced such a wonderful video about those things that you deeply believe. I believe in justice. I believe that all people are equal. Those deeply held beliefs are important. They're not tentative. But we do ask you to examine those beliefs. What do you believe? Why do you believe that? Now, unlike what you might hear in some quarters, we're not in the business of trying to convert you or to brainwash you. For every person on this campus, I can assure you that if there are 700 people on this campus, there are 700 different beliefs on a variety of measures. We are going to ask you to push on those beliefs. Why do you believe it? Some beliefs are subject to what we might call fact-checking. If somebody says, I believe that the sky is purple, then as we push on that, one of the first things we're going to do is, why do you believe that when your senses tell you something completely different? Now, there are lots of great conversations to be had, and Dr. Cicchetti and other members of the faculty will help you think through this. There's a whole field of epistemology. How do we know what we know, and what does it mean to know? We're not going to talk about those more today because it is a fascinating subject, but the point is that we're going to ask you to think about what you believe, reflect on why you believe it, and reflect on what the implications of those beliefs are, both for your actions and for how you relate to the world and our life together. What do you believe? Because what you believe is going to determine, in some respects, how you go about this journey that we've started with orientation and orienteering. Remember the phrase of the word orientation, this idea that the sun comes up in the east, and you know that. You believe that. If you believed something different going in, if you believed that the sun came up in the north, you'd be in real trouble. And so we have to check our beliefs because they're so important as we move forward. And as I said, perhaps most importantly today, as we move forward together. And so my final point is to remind us of this corporate nature of our work together, especially now. We're in this together. We must treat each other respectfully. As we challenge each other's beliefs, we do it respectfully, and we do it in the sense that it helps us all move forward as we think more clearly, as we understand why we believe things. I'm afraid that the recent pandemic and other things have made our situation worse. We were already in a long period, 20 years perhaps, where we seem to be losing the ability to disagree agreeably. There's a wonderful phrase, reasonable people can disagree. Reasonable people can look at the world and come to different conclusions. Not through any malice, not because the other side is ignorant or stupid or evil, but simply because they've put the world together. They're in different ways. They've come to different conclusions for maybe the very same set of facts, and we need to ask each other, again, how did you come to that conclusion? Help me understand where you're coming from, if you will. The pandemic seems to have made this worse. It seems to have shortened our fuses, and I regret that I've lived that out in the past couple of months sometimes. Less patient than I would like to be. We need to be patient. We need to be graceful with one another. It's frustrating. We talk a lot, you'll talk a lot in your time here about leadership. I mentioned it in a little video that maybe you saw shortly before the 4th of July. We ask you to be leaders. Usually leadership involves setting a goal, setting a vision, and helping people work towards that vision. It's hard, it's frustrating in this period where there's so much unpredictability. We're faced, like Lewis and Clark, with an area where we just don't know what's ahead. Leading in that context is hard. Being graceful, being patient can be hard, but it's so important. We have to do it together. Now more than ever, our individual actions and the way those actions come together is just of critical importance. Our individual welfare depends on our collective choices and our collective work together. One of my scholarly areas of research and interest is around this issue. They're sometimes known as collective action problems. What happens when all of us doing what's best for ourselves makes everybody worse off, the infamous prisoner's dilemma. And there are lots of other ways to think about those kinds of problems. And hopefully maybe I'll be invited to a class sometime and maybe give you a short lecture on that. It's one of my favorite topics. But we have to work together. And I'm going to apologize to my colleagues who heard this talk last year, because I'm going to close in the same way that I did last year, which I try not to do. But this was, given recent events, so appropriate and so important that I don't feel too bad about doing it. Because this is the end of the introduction to the autobiography of John Lewis, the civil rights hero who passed away a few weeks ago. One of the last survivors of the March on Selma and other great civil rights, and then, of course, as you know, went to Washington and spent a career in Congress working for civil rights. And in his autobiography, actually I think there may be a couple, but this particular one, he talks about how when he was a child, he grew up on a farm and was surrounded by relatives and in their other farms. Some of them were sharecroppers and some of them owned their land. And when the grown-ups were out either in the fields or doing whatever else their profession was, all the kids came together and they came to one house, and they were under the watchful eye of their Aunt Seneva. And like many country houses, I'm sure you've seen them, maybe your own house is like this. The house is up on a foundation, on an open foundation. Sometimes you see them on stacks of bricks in the corners and with an open subfloor. And that's the kind of house that they were in. He said sometimes as they gathered there, like we're very familiar with here in the South, they would see a line of thunderstorms approaching, maybe even a tornado approaching. And I'll now just read John Lewis's words. That was when Aunt Seneva told us to clasp hands. Line up and hold hands, she said, and we did as we were told. Then she had us walk as a group toward the corner of the room that was rising. The house is being lifted off of its foundation by the wind. We walked to the corner of the room that was rising. And from the kitchen to the front of the house we walked, the wind screaming outside, sheets of rain beating on the tin roof. Then we walked back in the other direction as the other end of the house began to lift. And so it went back and forth, 15 children walking with the wind, holding the trembling house down with the weight of our small bodies. Walking together, walking with the wind. And Lewis goes on to conclude, and then another corner would lift and we would go there, and eventually, inevitably, the storm would settle and the house would still stand. But we knew another storm would come and we would have to do it all over again. And we did. And we still do, he says, all of us, you and I, children holding hands, walking with the wind. That is America to me, not just the moment for civil rights, but the endless struggle to respond with decency, dignity, and a sense of brotherhood to all the challenges that face us as a nation, as a whole. I ask us today, as a community of Centenary, to clasp hands. Let's walk with the wind. Let's work together. Forward, Centenary. Thank you. At this point, I will ask Reverend Broderick to come and deliver our benediction, and then again, the passport point information will be available following that. Please enjoy the wonderful recording of the Centenary College Choir performing our alma mater. Thank you very much for tuning in.
Step up here. Students, faculty, staff, and Centenary friends, remember, we can still go forward and be bold, be brave, be kind, and may God keep you safe and keep you well as we go forward in peace. Amen.